The dust tasted of grit and endings. It settled on Jedediah Kane's tongue, a fine powder ground from 1,000 miles of baked earth and broken promises. The sun, a merciless copper coin in a bleached blue sky, hammered down on the clapboard town of redemption, making the very air shimmer and dance. Heat rose from the single, rutted street in waves, distorting the distant shapes of the Sawtooth Mountains until they looked like the jawbone of some great, forgotten beast. Jedediah stood on the splintered planks of the train platform, a solitary figure carved from granite and patience. He was a man built for this land, or perhaps unbuilt by it. His shoulders were broad, strained against the worn fabric of his shirt, and his hands, resting loosely at his sides, were maps of calloused hardship. His face, weathered and browned by a lifetime of sun and wind, was a mask of stoic indifference, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, betrayed a deep and abiding weariness. He was waiting, though he wished he were anywhere else on God's unforgiving earth. He smelled the train before he saw it, a scent of hot metal, coal smoke, and distance carried on the sluggish breeze. It was the smell of the outside world, a world he had long since turned his back on. The world that had sent his partner, Samuel, back to him in a cheap pine box 3 years ago. It was Samuel's final, foolhardy gesture that had brought him here today. A letter, delivered 6 months after the funeral, penned in Samuel's lupin optimistic script. It spoke of loneliness, of the need for a woman's touch to turn their hardscrabble ranch into a home, and confessed to a terrible, well-intentioned sin. He had answered an advertisement. He had arranged for a bride, paid her passage, and signed Jedediah's name to the contract. The letter had ended with a plea for understanding, a final wish from a dead man that Jedediah could not honor, yet felt shackled by. He had tried to cancel it, sending a wire to a faceless agency in a city he could not picture, but the reply was curt. The arrangement was binding. The passage was paid. She was coming. The locomotive hissed into the station, a dying iron dragon breathing its last plume of gray steam. Its groaning complaint filled the silence that usually owned this town. Doors clanked open, and a handful of dusty travelers descended, their faces pale and drawn. And then he saw her. She was the last to step from the carriage, a small, slender figure standing in a pool of impossible shadow against the glaring sun. She wore a dark, high-collared dress, the kind of garment wholly unsuited for this furnace of a territory. Her hair was the color of a polished jet, pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the delicate, sharp lines of her face. She held a single, battered wooden case in one hand. She was not the hardy, broad-hipped farmer's daughter he had vaguely pictured. She was Chinese, her features as foreign to this landscape as a pearl in a hog trough. The murmurs started immediately, a low rustle of surprise and suspicion from the few townsfolk who had gathered to watch the train's arrival. The collective judgment of the community, the Greek chorus of redemption, began its first verse. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over the town, over the hostile, curious faces, and finally settled on him. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, unnerving stillness. She walked toward him, her steps measured and even on the dusty platform. The contract he had received had a name, Maylene. It had listed her skills as domestic arts, bookkeeping, and general homemaking. It said nothing of the profound dignity she carried like a shield, a dignity that made the dusty, ramshackle town seem even more crude and unwelcoming. She stopped a few feet from him, the silence stretching taut between them. The world expected him to be her husband, her protector. He was a man who had forgotten how to protect anything but the bitter solitude he had cultivated on his ranch. "You are Jedediah Kane?" Her voice was low and clearer than he expected, the words precise, with only a trace of an accent he couldn't place. It wasn't the voice of a frightened mail-order bride. It was the voice of someone conducting business. He gave a curt nod, the only answer he could muster. The lie felt like a stone in his throat. He was not the man in the letter she had read, the man who had supposedly yearned for her arrival. He was the unwilling inheritor of a dead man's foolish dream. "I am Mei Lin," she said, as if confirming an entry in a ledger. "The arrangement is fulfilled." He looked at her small frame, at the impractical dress, at the single case that held all her worldly possessions. He thought of his ranch, a one-room cabin, a leaking barn, and 300 acres of stubborn dirt that gave up just enough to keep a man alive and miserable. There was no room for her. There was no place for her in his life, which he had so carefully emptied of all complication. A wave of frustration, cold and sharp, cut through his weariness. This was Samuel's final, catastrophic mistake, and he was the one left to clean up the mess. He wanted to put her back on the train, to send her away and reclaim the harsh peace of his isolation. But the train was already building steam for its departure, its whistle a mournful cry that sealed his fate. He was trapped. They both were. He finally spoke, his voice a rusty rasp. "The wagon is over there." He gestured with his chin, not trusting himself to look at her directly. He turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. The weight of the town's eyes was a physical pressure on his back. He had brought an outsider here, a woman who looked like she belonged in a porcelain painting, not a dust-choked purgatory. His quiet life was over. He had a feeling it had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the woman walking silently behind him held all of them in her small, steady hands. He didn't offer to take her case. He didn't offer a word of welcome. He just led her toward the wagon, the silence between them as vast and empty as the plains stretching out before them. He pointed her to the rough wooden seat, then moved to the front to untie the horses. He could feel her watching him, her gaze analytical, observant. He felt like a specimen under glass. The whole arrangement felt wrong, a poorly stitched seam in the fabric of his life, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that it was about to rip wide open. The ride to the ranch was a long, silent ordeal. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted track, kicking up plumes of ochre dust that coated everything in a fine, gritty film. The sun beat down, relentless. Jedediah kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the familiar, lonely silhouette of his homestead nestled against a low rise of granite hills. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress against the world, and he was now bringing the world inside its walls. Mei Lin sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't complain about the heat or the dust. She simply watched the landscape unspool, her expression unreadable. He had expected tears, or perhaps frightened questions. He received only a profound and unsettling silence. It was a silence that seemed more knowing than his own. When they finally arrived, the bleak reality of the place seemed to hang in the air. The cabin was little more than a shack, chinked with mud that had cracked in the heat. The barn sagged to one side, its timber bleached gray by years of sun. A few hardy chickens scratched in the dirt near a meager vegetable patch that was losing its battle with the arid soil. This was his kingdom, a patch of dirt and disappointment. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down, the silence of the prairie rushing in to replace the sound of the wheels. "This is it," he said, the words blunt and devoid of any warmth. She looked at the cabin, then at the barn, her gaze lingering on the details. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not disappointment, but assessment. She was measuring, calculating. He felt a surge of raw, helpless anger. Anger at Samuel for his meddling, anger at this woman for her composure, and, most of all, anger at himself for his inability to fix any of it. He needed space. He needed to think. He couldn't have her in his cabin, a constant, silent presence in the small space that was his entire world. The decision was made in a moment of desperate, unthinking practicality. "The cabin's not fit," he stated, the words clipped. "One room." He pointed a thumb toward a smaller, sturdier outbuilding set away from the main barn. "That was the old piggery. It's clean. Haven't kept hogs in years. There's a cot. You can stay there." He didn't look at her as he said it. The words sounded harsher than he intended, an edict of banishment. It was not meant as an act of cruelty, but one of pure, overwhelmed self-preservation. He needed a wall between them, and the walls of the old pig barn would have to do. He expected a protest, an outburst, anything. Instead, she simply inclined her head in a gesture of acknowledgement. "I understand," she said, her voice even. She picked up her case and walked toward the designated building without a backward glance. He stood by the wagon, watching her go, a knot of something sour and unfamiliar tightening in his gut. It might have been shame. The sun began its slow descent, painting the bruised purple sky with streaks of orange and pink. The silence she left behind was different now. It was no longer his own. It was a shared silence, heavy with unspoken questions and the vast, yawning space of their misunderstanding. He had sent her to the pig barn to sleep, and, in doing so, had drawn a line in the dust between them. He just didn't realize yet that she was the one who would decide when to cross it. That night, the sky broke. The change came without warning. A sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. The air, which had been stagnant and scorching all day, grew heavy and thick, charged with a nervous energy. Distant thunder grumbled, a low growl from the belly of the mountains. Jedediah sat at his rough-hewn table, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. He hadn't been able to eat. The piece of dried jerky in his hand felt like leather in his mouth. Every rumble of thunder was a reproach. He pictured her in the old barn, a small solitary figure in the growing dark. He had told himself it was for the best, that the distance was necessary, but the approaching storm made a mockery of his reasoning. It was no place for anyone to shelter. The first drops of rain hit the tin roof like scattered pebbles. Within minutes, it was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world outside the single window. Wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, a mournful, shrieking sound. The storm was a physical assault, a wild, untamed thing that reminded him just how fragile everything was. His ranch, his solitude, his carefully constructed peace. He stood up and walked to the door, peering out into the maelstrom. The pig barn was a faint dark shape against the strobing flashes of lightning. He couldn't leave her out there. Whatever his frustration, whatever the complications she represented, he was not a man who let another human being face a tempest in a derelict barn. It was a violation of a code he hadn't even realized he lived by. Cursing Samuel, the storm, and his own foolishness, he pulled on his oilskin coat, grabbed a second lantern, and stepped out into the roaring chaos. The wind tore at him, and the rain was cold and blinding. He leaned into the gale, his boots sinking into the mud that was already swallowing the yard. He reached the pig barn and shoved the heavy door open. The interior was dark and musty, smelling of old straw and damp earth. The cot he'd mentioned was there, but it was empty. A cold knot of fear tightened in his chest. Had she run, fled into the storm, into the vast, dangerous night of the prairie? He swept the lantern light across the small space. Her wooden case was on the floor, but she was gone. He turned back toward the main cabin, a frantic urgency seizing him. It was then that a flash of lightning illuminated the entire homestead, and he saw it. A faint, steady glow emanated from the window of his own cabin. He stumbled back through the mud, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He threw the cabin door open, sending a spray of rainwater across the wooden floor. And there she was. Mei Lin was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the scattered, precious contents of the one thing he valued more than his solitude: his ledgers. The storm had found a weak spot in the roof right above his desk, and a steady stream of water had cascaded down onto the neat stacks of paper. His entire ranch, every transaction, every debt, every slim profit, was recorded in those books. They were a chaotic, disorganized mess that only he could decipher, but they were his, and they were being ruined. But they were not being ruined. Mei Lin had dragged the desk away from the leak. She had taken every soaked page and laid it out carefully on the dry sections of the floor. She had built up the fire in the hearth, and now, in the warm, dry air, she was meticulously blotting each page with a spare rag, her movements precise and economical. She had saved them. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, her eyes reflecting the firelight. There was no panic in her, only a quiet, focused intensity. "The roof is compromised above your desk," she stated simply, as if reporting on the weather. The ink was beginning to run. "I have stabilized the documents." Jedediah stood there, dripping on the floor, the cold rain on his coat a stark contrast to the warmth inside. He looked from her face to the sea of paper spread across his floor. He had expected to find her cowering or gone. Instead, he had found her in the heart of his life, not as a helpless intruder, but as a preserver. She had faced the first test of this harsh land, not a bucking horse or a hostile town, but a crisis that threatened the very foundation of his existence. And she had not only survived it, she had mastered it. In that moment, his perception of her shifted, cracking the foundation of his own prejudice and fear. She was not a liability. She was something else entirely. "The wind forced the door of the barn," she continued, her voice pulling him from his reverie. "I saw the light in here flicker and go out. When the lightning flashed, I could see the water through the window." She had not come for her own comfort. She had come to help. He didn't know what to say. The words "thank you" felt inadequate, foreign on his tongue. He walked over to the hearth, shedding his wet coat. He looked down at the pages. She had not just laid them out to dry. She had begun to put them in order, sorting them by date and type with an instinctual logic that stunned him. His chaotic system was being transformed into something coherent. "You understand these?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "They are numbers," she replied, her gaze returning to a particularly water-warped page. "Numbers are universal language. Yours tell a difficult story." A fragile truce was born in that moment, forged in the heart of the storm and the quiet competence of a woman he had completely misunderstood. He pulled up a stool and sat down. not beside her, but near the fire, a silent participant in the rescue of his own history. He watched her work, her slender fingers moving with an expert's grace. He saw the way she pieced together fragments of information, her brow furrowed in concentration. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a new kind of quiet settled. It was no longer the quiet of isolation, but the quiet of shared purpose. He passed her a dry rag. She took it with a slight nod. For the rest of the night, they worked in near silence. Two strangers bound by the common task of saving a life recorded in ink and paper. The world was being washed away outside, but within the four walls of his cabin, something new was being carefully, painstakingly put in order. Jedediah Kane, a man who had thought himself entirely self-reliant, was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. The days that followed the storm fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. The truce held, fragile as a spider's web in the morning dew, yet surprisingly strong. Jedediah had cleared a corner of the cabin, setting up the cot from the pig barn for her. It was a concession that felt monumental. He found he could not send her back to the outbuilding. Her presence in the main cabin had already become a fixed point in his new reality. They moved around each other with a practiced economy of motion, the small space dictating a kind of enforced, intimate choreography. There was little talk. Their communication was a language of actions. He would rise before dawn, the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee already filling the air as he stoked the fire. He would return from his morning chores to find a plate of something simple but nourishing on the table. Biscuits lighter than any he had ever tasted, or eggs cooked to perfection. Her culinary skills, it turned out, were as precise and understated as everything else about her. He, in turn, began to observe. He watched her as she spent hours at his desk, the rescued ledgers now her domain. She had requested a new ink pot and a fresh stack of paper from the general store on his last trip to town, and she used them to create a new set of books. Her script was a thing of beauty, elegant columns of figures that brought a pristine, terrifying clarity to his financial chaos. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as he mended a harness or cleaned his rifle, fascinated by the intensity of her focus. She was not just a bookkeeper. She was a scholar of numbers, an artist of accounts. His respect for her grew with each passing day, a slow, grudging vine taking root in the barren soil of his skepticism. He started leaving a piece of fruit or a cup of fresh water on the desk without a word, small offerings in their silent conversation. The community, however, was not silent. On his infrequent trips into Redemption for supplies, Jedediah felt their judgment like a physical weight. The whispers followed him down the main street. He saw the women of the town pull their skirts aside as he passed, their faces tight with disapproval. The men at the saloon would fall quiet when he entered, their conversations resuming in hushed tones only after he had collected his goods and left. He was the man who lived with the Chinese woman, the man who had sent for an outsider and now kept her cloistered on his remote ranch. Their gossip was a poison, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it found a more potent form. The poison arrived in a cloud of dust and arrogance one sweltering afternoon. A fine carriage, pulled by two magnificent black horses, rolled up to the ranch. It was a vehicle of such ostentatious wealth that it looked utterly alien against the backdrop of his struggling homestead. From it descended Silas Thorne. Thorne owned half the county and had a mortgage on the other half. He was a man who feasted on the misfortune of others, a vulture dressed in a tailored suit. His face was fleshy and pale, his eyes small and predatory. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. Jedediah met him in the yard, his stance immediately defensive. He had had dealings with Thorne before, and none of them had been pleasant. Thorne held the note on a significant portion of Jedediah's land, a debt inherited from Samuel's more ambitious and less practical ventures. "Cain," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, oily purr that set Jedediah's teeth on edge. He surveyed the ranch with a look of undisguised contempt. "Still scratching a living from this god-forsaken rock pile, I see. What do you want, Thorne?" Jedediah's voice was flat, betraying none of the anxiety churning in his gut. Thorne smiled, a humorless stretching of his thin lips. He produced a sheaf of papers from inside his coat. "Just a friendly visit. Business. It seems your partner Samuel was a bit of a gambler. Not with cards, but with interest rates. The note on this property has come due. The grace period has expired." He held out the papers. It was a foreclosure notice. The words seemed to leap off the page, stark and final. At that moment, the cabin door opened, and Maylene stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the voices. She stood in the shadows, her presence immediately drawing Thorne's attention. His eyes narrowed, and a sneer twisted his face. "Well, well, what have we here? I heard you'd acquired some exotic livestock, Cain. Didn't realize it came in such a small package." The insult, casual and venomous, landed in the charged air between them. Jedediah felt a surge of white-hot fury, a protective instinct so fierce and unfamiliar it nearly choked him. Before he could speak, Maylin's voice cut through the tension as cool and sharp as ice. "You are mistaken," she said, stepping forward into the sunlight. Her gaze was fixed on Thorne, direct and unwavering. "I am not livestock. I am this ranch's accountant." Thorne let out a short, barking laugh. "Accountant? A woman? This one? Cain, you never fail to amuse." He turned his attention back to Jedediah, dismissing her completely. "The offer is simple. Sign the deed over to me, and I'll forgive the debt. I'll even give you $100 to pack your things and disappear. It's more than this heap of dirt is worth." The threat was now laid bare. It was not just a financial transaction, it was an act of annihilation. Thorne wanted to erase him, to wipe his existence from the land. Jedediah looked at the papers in Thorne's hand, then at the hard, unyielding line of his own horizon. This land was all he had left of his life, of his friendship with Samuel, of himself. Losing it felt like a second death. "I'll need to review the documents," Maylin said, her voice still impossibly calm. She had walked down the steps and now stood beside Jedediah. It was the first time they had presented a united front to the world. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. "There's nothing for you to review, girlie. It's all legal and binding. Your man here is bankrupt." "Nevertheless," she insisted, holding out her hand, "the documents." For a moment, Thorne seemed taken aback by her audacity. Then, with a condescending chuckle, he slapped the papers into her outstretched hand. "By all means, entertain yourself. You have until the end of the week, Cain. Then my men will be here to escort you off my property." He turned without another word, climbed back into his opulent carriage and departed, leaving them in a swirling cloud of dust and dread. Jedediah felt the fight drain out of him. The foreclosure was a death sentence. He knew the numbers were bad. He just hadn't known how bad. He looked down at Maylin. She was already scanning the top page, her brow furrowed in that familiar expression of intense concentration. She was not looking at him or at the dust cloud of the departing carriage. She was looking at the numbers, and in her eyes he did not see despair. He saw a challenge. The external threat had arrived, and it was a monster. But, for the first time, Jedediah Kane realized he might not be facing it alone. The foreclosure notice was a tangible manifestation of their shared crisis. It sat on the rough-hewn table between them, a declaration of war written in the cold, unforgiving language of finance and law. For Jedediah, the document was an ending. He saw the sum of Samuel's bad decisions and his own weary struggle culminating in this final, insurmountable failure. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He saw only one path forward, a violent confrontation he was unlikely to win. His hands knew the weight of a rifle far better than they knew the intricacies of a legal contract. Mei Lin, however, saw something else entirely. For her, the notice was not an ending, but a starting point. It was a puzzle. She spread the papers out under the lamplight, her calm a stark contrast to his agitated energy. She placed her own newly created ledgers beside Thorne's documents, and for hours she worked. She was a general marshaling her forces, comparing columns of figures, cross-referencing dates, her finger tracing lines of debt that snaked through the pages like venomous serpents. Jedediah eventually stopped pacing and sat down across from her, watching. He felt useless, a blunt instrument in a battle that required a scalpel. "He is a cheat," she said finally, her voice low and certain. The words hung in the silent cabin. "Everyone knows Thorne is a cheat," Jedediah countered, his tone heavy with resignation. "Proving it is another matter. He owns the bank. He owns the judge." "Ownership does not change mathematics," she replied, not looking up. "The interest rates he has applied are predatory, and I suspect illegal. But more than that, they are inconsistent. Look." She pushed a page toward him. "Here, the rate compounds monthly. Here, on a similar loan from the same period, it compounds quarterly. There is no logic to it. It is the work of a man who believes no one will ever check his sums, a man who is arrogant." She had given him a glimmer of hope, a fragile thing in the overwhelming darkness. The next few days were a blur of intense, focused work. Their forced proximity became a true partnership. He would brew coffee and keep the fire stoked while she worked late into the night. During the day, he would answer her endless, precise questions. When did Samuel purchase the breeding bull? Was the east pasture fenced in the spring of 78 or 79? Show me the receipt for the well pump. He would retrieve old forgotten scraps of paper from a tin box under his cot, and she would fit each one into the larger mosaic she was constructing. He brought his knowledge of the land, of the seasons, of the physical labor that had built the ranch. She brought her formidable intellect, her ability to see the story hidden within the numbers. They were two halves of a single, functioning unit, fighting for their shared survival. One evening she looked up from the papers, her eyes bright with a cold, clear anger. "There is a phantom loan," she announced. "A debt of $500 that appears on Thorne's summary from 2 years ago. But there is no corresponding entry in your ledgers. There is no record of a purchase, no new equipment, no livestock. This debt, Jedediah, I do not believe it is real." The revelation was a lightning strike. A fabricated debt of that size was the cornerstone of Thorne's claim. Without it, the entire foreclosure was built on a foundation of sand. Their passive defense had just become an active investigation. Samuel was a fool about money, but he wasn't a liar, Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. "He would have told me. He would have written it down somewhere." Perhaps he did, Mei Lin mused. Thorne's documents are all copies, official copies from the bank, but copies nonetheless. To prove forgery, we would need to find the original loan agreements, the ones Samuel signed. The quest seemed impossible. Samuel was dead. His personal effects were few. The tin box of receipts, a few worn books, some clothes Jedediah had long since given away. They ransacked the cabin, searching for a hidden file, a misplaced letter, anything. They found nothing. Despair began to creep back in, a cold fog at the edges of their hope. It was Jedediah who finally made the connection. He was staring at the wall, at the poorly mounted deer antlers that had been there since he and Samuel first built the cabin. Samuel had been so proud of that hunt. He remembered his partner painstakingly securing the antlers to a thick wooden plaque. It had always seemed too heavy, too ornate for a simple rack. Acting on a sudden, desperate hunch, he stood on a stool and lifted the heavy plaque off the wall. The back had been hollowed out. Tucked inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thin leather satchel. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were the original contracts, and something more. Tucked between the pages was a handwritten letter from Samuel. His familiar script was shaky, filled with a frantic energy. He wrote that he had discovered Thorne was cheating him, that the banker had altered the terms of their agreements after they were signed. He had confronted Thorne, who had laughed in his face. Samuel, fearing for his safety, had hidden the original documents, intending to take them to a federal marshal in the state capital. The letter was dated the day before he left on the trip from which he never returned. They stared at the papers, at the dead man's final, desperate words. This was no longer just a financial dispute. Samuel hadn't died of a fever on the trail, as the official report had stated. He had been silenced. The crisis had deepened, twisting into something far more sinister. They were not just fighting for a ranch anymore. They were fighting for justice for a murdered friend. The great unmasking, Mei Lin whispered, her voice filled with a quiet awe. She held up one of Thorne's forged documents next to one of Samuel's originals. The difference was undeniable. A single, crucial number in the interest rate clause had been altered. The signature was Samuel's, but the terms were Thorne's. "He has the town marshal in his pocket," Jedediah said, the reality of their situation crashing down on him. "We can't just walk in and accuse him. He'll have us arrested or worse before we can even speak." "Then we cannot use the front door," Mei Lin replied, her gaze turning toward the window, toward the distant lights of redemption. A plan was beginning to form in her sharp, tactical mind. "We must create a situation where the marshal has no choice but to see the evidence, a public situation." Jedediah looked at her, at this quiet, unassuming woman who had methodically dismantled a tyrant's empire with ink and paper. He had demonstrated his competence with the land, with his physical strength. Now she was demonstrating hers, a mastery of strategy, a mind that saw not just the problem, but the precise, elegant shape of the solution. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of this crisis, was about to be tested by fire, and as he looked at the resolve in her eyes, he knew they would face it together. The plan was audacious, a delicate piece of clockwork that relied on perfect timing and a deep understanding of their enemy. Mei Lin was the architect, her mind laying out the sequence of events with chilling precision. Jedediah was the instrument, his knowledge of the town and its rhythms the key to its execution. The final confrontation would not be a gunfight in the street, but a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to trap a monster in the public square. Their target was Thorne's office, a brick building on the main street that also housed the town's only bank. It was his fortress, the seat of his power. Mei Lin's study of the town, gleaned from Jedediah's descriptions and a hand-drawn map he'd made, had revealed a critical weakness. The office had a rear entrance opening onto a narrow, seldom-used alley. The key, she reasoned, would be with the man who locked up the town's businesses at night, the marshal himself, a man of predictable habits. "He makes his rounds at 9, Jedediah confirmed, tracing the route on the map with a calloused finger. "He stops at the saloon for a drink at the end of it. The key ring hangs on a hook just inside his office door. He never locks his own office until he leaves for the night. That is our window," Mei Lin stated, "but we need a diversion. Something significant enough to draw every eye in town, including the marshals, away from that alley." Jedediah looked out at his small herd of cattle grazing peacefully in the twilight. "I can create a diversion," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in days. The next evening, as dusk settled like a gray blanket over the prairie, they put their plan into motion. Jedediah rode toward town, not on the main road, but through the rough country to the north, pushing a dozen of his most spirited steers ahead of him. Mei Lin, dressed in dark, practical clothing Jedediah had given her, entered redemption on foot from the south, a ghost slipping through the shadows. She moved with a silent, purposeful grace, her small frame melting into the darkness between buildings. At precisely 9 o'clock, a gunshot echoed from the north end of town, followed by the thunder of hooves and the panicked shouts of men. Jedediah had fired into the air, stampeding the cattle straight down the main street. Chaos erupted. Men poured out of the saloon, tables were overturned, and the entire town's attention was fixed on the spectacle of a dozen panicked animals charging through their midst. The marshal, cursing, ran from his office, his focus entirely on the bovine mayhem. It was the opening Mei Lin needed. She slipped into the now empty marshal's office, her heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. The key ring was exactly where Jedediah had said it would be. She took it, her fingers identifying the heavy iron key to Thorne's back door by touch alone. She was out of the office and in the alley in less than a minute. The lock on Thorne's back door was stiff, but it turned with a loud, grating click. She slid inside into the lion's den. The office was opulent, a temple of greed. A massive oak desk dominated the room, and the air smelled of cigar smoke and leather. She ignored it all, her eyes scanning the wall of filing cabinets. Samuel's letter had described the contract as being bound in a blue leather folio. She worked quickly, her fingers flying through the files, her mind a cold, clear instrument of purpose. She found it in the third drawer, tucked away under a false bottom. The blue folio. The original, unaltered contract. A floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. "I am impressed." Silas Thorne's oily voice slithered out of the darkness. He stepped out from behind a heavy curtain, a small silver derringer held loosely in his hand. "I truly underestimated you. A fatal mistake, it seems." His eyes were cold, devoid of anything but predatory calculation. He had not been drawn out by the diversion. He had been waiting. "The cattle were a clever touch," he continued, advancing on her slowly. "But I have known Jedediah Kane for years. He is a man of muscle, not subtlety. This plan, this had your delicate touch all over it." At that moment, the back door burst open. Jedediah stood there, his face a mask of cold fury, a heavy Colt revolver in his hand. His diversion had worked perfectly, but his instincts had told him something was wrong. He had circled back, his gut screaming that he had left her alone for too long. "Let her go, Thorn." Jedediah's voice was a low rumble of thunder. Thorn laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Or you'll shoot me, and the marshal will hang you for it?" "I think not." He gestured with the derringer toward Mei Lin. "Give me the folio." Mei Lin did not move. She clutched the blue leather folio to her chest. This was the moment she had planned for, the final move in her calculated game. She looked not at Jedediah, but directly at Thorn. "You will not shoot me," she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Because if you do, this folio, and the testimony of the man who just saw you hold a gun on an unarmed woman, will be enough to see you hanged for the murder of Samuel Lee." She had laid the trap. The charge was no longer forgery. It was murder. As she spoke, the town marshal appeared in the doorway behind Jedediah, drawn by the sounds of the confrontation. His face was a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Thorn's composure finally cracked. His face contorted in a snarl of rage, and he lunged, not at Mei Lin, but at Jedediah, seeing him as the greater physical threat. Jedediah met his charge, the two men crashing into the massive desk. The derringer flew from Thorn's hand, skittering across the floor. Jedediah was stronger, but Thorn was a desperate, vicious fighter. He grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk and swung it wildly, catching Jedediah on the side of the head. Jedediah staggered back, momentarily stunned. Thorn seized the opportunity, turning to grab Mei Lin to use her as a shield, but he had underestimated her again. As he reached for her, she dropped the folio and moved with a speed that defied her small stature. She drove the heel of her hand upward into the soft part of his chin, a sharp, precise blow that snapped his head back. He stumbled, his eyes wide with shock. It was all the time Jedediah needed. He shook off the blow and slammed Thorn against the wall, pinning him there. "It's over." Jedediah grunted, his grip like iron. The marshal, his face pale, finally stepped forward, his own gun drawn. He looked at the folio on the floor, at the wild-eyed, defeated land baron, and at the unlikely pair who had brought him down. He was a compromised man, but he was not a fool. He saw the truth laid bare in the wreckage of the office. He knew which side he had to choose. In the immediate aftermath, a profound quiet descended. The marshal led a sputtering, defeated Silas Thorn away in handcuffs. The sounds from the street faded as the last of the cattle were rounded up. Jedediah and Mei Lin were left alone in the ransacked office, the air thick with the scent of ozone and victory. Jedediah leaned against the desk, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his temple. His head throbbed. Mei Lin picked up the blue folio, her hands steady. She came to him, her expression softening for the first time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, gently dabbing at the cut on his head. Her touch was light, clinical, yet it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with his injury. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a brilliant accountant or a cunning strategist, but the woman who had stood her ground in the face of death for him, for their home. He noticed a small, angry red mark on her arm where Thorn had grabbed her. Without thinking, he reached out, his rough thumb gently tracing the edge of the bruise. "He hurt you," he said, the words a quiet accusation. "It is nothing," she replied, her dark eyes holding his. But it was not nothing. It was everything. In that quiet moment of tending to each other's wounds, the last of the walls between them crumbled. The transactional arrangement, the fragile truce, it all fell away, replaced by a bond forged in shared crisis and cemented in mutual sacrifice. He had protected her, and she, in her own way, had protected him. They were partners. The realization settled over him, not with a crash, but with a deep, resonant sense of rightness. He had started this journey as an isolated man, guarding his solitude. He now stood as half of a whole, and the future, for the first time in years, did not look like a lonely, empty horizon. 3 months passed. Autumn laid its gentle, golden hand on the prairie. The relentless heat of summer gave way to cool, crisp mornings and evenings that smelled of wood smoke and curing earth. The ranch, once a testament to stubborn survival, was now beginning to show signs of quiet prosperity. The foreclosure was a distant memory, the notice having been torn up by a chastened town marshal. Thorne's empire, built on a foundation of lies, was crumbling under the weight of a federal investigation sparked by Samuel's hidden letter and May Lynn's irrefutable accounting. Redemption was slowly breathing cleaner air. The changes to the ranch were subtle, but significant. The sagging barn had been reinforced, its roof patched and secure. The cabin's leaky roof was mended, and a new window had been cut into the west wall, letting in the warm afternoon light. Jedediah had built a small lean-to addition off the back, a room for May Lynn that afforded her a measure of privacy, though they both knew the walls of the cabin no longer represented a barrier between them. They were simply a practical feature of a shared home. The change was most visible in the yard. Where the pathetic, sun-scorched vegetable patch had once struggled, there was now a thriving garden. Neat rows of late-season greens, squash, and hardy herbs grew, a testament to their combined efforts. One cool morning, they worked together in that garden. Jedediah turned the soil with a fork, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy, familiar rhythm. May Lynn followed behind him, her slender fingers carefully planting garlic cloves for the coming winter, pressing each one into the dark, rich earth. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that exists only between two people who have no need for words to understand one another. It was a silence filled with the scrape of his fork, the rustle of leaves, and the contented clucking of the chickens. He paused, leaning on his fork, and watched her. He watched the way the early morning sun caught the strands of her dark hair, the focused intensity of her expression as she worked. He thought back to the woman who had stepped off the train, a stranger in an impractical dress, and the man he had been, a bitter recluse hiding from the world. The distance between then and now felt like a lifetime. She had not just saved his ranch. She had, in her quiet, methodical way, saved him. She had ordered the chaos of his life, found the hidden truths, and shown him a future he had never believed possible. He had been working on something for weeks, in the quiet moments after she had gone to sleep. He had carved it from a piece of seasoned cottonwood, his calloused hands, so used to the rough tools of ranching, learning a new, more delicate language. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled it out. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. The details were rough, but the form was full of life and care. He walked over to her and held it out. She looked up from her work, her hands still covered in soil. She looked at the bird, then at his face, her dark eyes searching his. She took it from him, her cool, soil-dusted fingers brushing against his. She turned the small carving over and over, her thumb tracing the lines of the feathers. He cleared his throat, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate in the vastness of what he wanted to say. "This place," he began, his voice rougher than usual. He gestured with his chin at the cabin, the barn, the wide expanse of land stretching to the horizon. The ranch, it's yours too, if you want it. It was not a proposal of marriage in the conventional sense. It was something more grounded, more real. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the truth that had grown between them. This was their land, their home, their future. It was an offering of everything he was and everything he had. Mei Lin looked from the wooden bird in her hand to the man standing before her. His face was still a mask of stoicism, but his eyes, the color of a clearing sky after a storm, held a raw, unguarded vulnerability. She saw the arc of his healing, the slow, painful journey from an isolated fortress of a man to a trusting partner. She saw her own journey reflected there as well, from the underestimated outsider to the essential heart of this home. She closed her hand around the small bird, its wooden form warm and solid against her palm. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, transforming her usually serious features. "I know," she said. The two words were enough. They were everything. They were a promise, a commitment, an acceptance. They were the final, perfectly placed stones in the foundation of a new life. He nodded once, a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lifting from his shoulders. He turned back to his work, and she to hers, two people planting roots in the stubborn soil, side by side, ready to face the coming winter and all the seasons after, together. The silence that returned was the most peaceful he had ever known.